Okay, great. I want to thank the Liberty Forum for having me. It's great to be here. I wish I was in California. The good news from Washington is I think that this national nightmare is going to end relatively soon in the coming weeks. So I'm fairly optimistic that things will calm down and we'll get back to normal. A little bit about myself. As Erica mentioned, I've been covering China issue for many years. Back in 2000, I published a book called The China Threat, which was a play on the Chinese government's notion of what they call the China threat theory. I said, this is not a theory, this is a real threat. And I was one of the first people to start to sound the alarm on what I regard as really one of the most serious strategic threats facing the United States and the whole world. And so I wrote this book, and again, every publisher after that told me that they wouldn't publish a single topic China book. I wanted to do more on China. And I don't know the reason why, but there was a reluctance on the part of publishers to publish stuff. And that went on for many years. They said, you can have chapters of your books on China. And I did some on cyber attacks by China and information warfare. But just last year, I said, well, I got to do it. And so I even decided I was going to basically publish the book myself. This is a really, this presentation tonight is about as topical as you could possibly get. Even today, the story that I wrote today, and it dates back to January. But let me start at the beginning before I get to that. This is a picture here of the Chinese People's Armed Police wearing masks and the outbreak of the coronavirus. And I contrasted that with the previous picture. I'm going to give you a little preview tonight. I've just completed the late draft of a new monograph ebook that will be coming out in very soon by the same publisher that did Deceiving the Sky. It's called How China's Communist Party Made the World Sick. And I'm going to really kind of give you a gist of what's going to be in that monograph. But I encourage you to really read the details, the fine print, when it comes out. Like I say, within the next couple of weeks. My story tonight starts with what is called, excuse me, the Wuhan Medical Treatment Center. This is also the main hospital in Wuhan, China. Wuhan is considered the Chicago of China in the way that New York is the main city and Chicago is kind of the second city. Wuhan is second city to Beijing. Well, on December 1st, an elderly Chinese man, pensioner, showed up at this facility with unusual symptoms of pneumonia. He would turn out to be the first person to contract this horrible new disease, which was later found out to be caused by a bat coronavirus. We've learned a lot in the last few weeks about viruses, and if we weren't germaphobes before, we're all germaphobes and microphobes now. But this new disease basically started, and this is the earliest I could find. And again, everything that I'm reporting on here is sketchy because the communist government in China, the Communist Party of China, has been reluctant to release information about what's going on with this virus from the very beginning. And I'm going to trace a little bit of that tonight. So this is the place where it all started. It's this patient showed up. And within weeks, thousands of people were coming down, contracting this new disease, which was initially called the Wuhan pneumonia in China. Officially, it was called the Wuhan pneumonia. But when the communist government realized that this was a propaganda pitfall for the Communist Party of China, which I I like to say that in order to understand why the Chinese government and party does things, you really have to understand the Communist Party of China, its ideology, and what motivated its strategy. And I do that in Deceiving the Sky, and I'll touch on it a little bit in this. But the initial reaction of Beijing authorities, that is the Communist Party, which is controlling this country. It's about 80 million people that control a country of 1.9 billion, 1.4 billion people. They're completely corrupt. They're reviled. Now, of course, you won't get that from Chinese nationals who have become very nationalistic. The party has understood that its ideology is not attractive anymore, and that it engages in massive human rights violations, arms control violations, sending nuclear missile launchers to North Korea, nuclear warhead technology to Iran, and places like that. Okay. One of the first doctors in China, so we're in early December now, and the first patient has come down with what is known as the Wuhan virus. And this doctor is Dr. Ai Fen. She's a senior doctor at the Wuhan Central Hospital. And she sounded the alarm on this outbreak. She was one of the first doctors to start telling her coworkers, because she recognized that what is happening here is a very dangerous situation. Flash backwards to the year 2003. At that time, there was an outbreak of something called the severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS. And SARS was also a virus that was caused by a bat coronavirus. That is, a bat that had been living in bats for thousands of years, and then all of a sudden, it infected humans. Not only did it infect humans, but it became very contagious, and it spread rapidly around the world. Dr. Ai Fen was one of the first people to sound the alarm. She was repressed, as were many others. She posted a warning on WeChat about the dangers, and she's reprimanded. She issues instructions for her staff to wear protective clothing. She said, "I knew there must be human-to-human transmission," she said. This is a very significant factor. Very early on, the Chinese authorities, in a bid to cover up the outbreak of this disease, announced to the world through the World Health Organization that this disease was not transmittable human to human. The initial outbreak was believed to have taken place at a market. This is another doctor, Dr. Li Wenliang, one of the 8 doctors who spoke out about the cover-up. Again, this doctor eventually died of the COVID-19 disease, and he became an instant hero to hundreds of millions of Chinese people. This was a doctor who very early on, again around December 31st, was the first to announce that, hey, this is a dangerous new virus. Wear your protective equipment. Sound the alarm. This is a dangerous situation. He was forced by the police to sign a confession that stated that his comments were illegal, that he was basically spreading rumors, and all he was trying to do was to protect his fellow countrymen. So he sent out an online message, as I mentioned. He said the symptoms were similar to SARS, and he warned to wear protective clothing. 4 days later, they arrested him, and then he would die on February 7th. Now, this is the supposed epicenter of the outbreak. It's called the Wuhan Huanan Seafood Market. It's what is known in China as a wet market. China basically has a culture which likes to eat wild animals. And it was believed that this was the center of the outbreak. That theory was early on announced by Chinese officials, who said that the first 41 cases of the virus most of those people had some exposure to this market. But the interesting thing was that the very first person, that December 1st case, he had no connection to the market. And in the very beginning, the very first people, this also had no connection. So this is a mystery. China acted very swiftly to go into this market. They closed it and they swept away all of the wild animals and cleaned it. And senior U.S. officials have told me in doing research for my monograph that it's very unusual that they did that. They basically succeeded in covering up evidence by doing that. Now, this is the Wuhan Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It is located less than 3 miles from that market. Now, in this Wuhan Center for Disease Control, the CDC, is a researcher whose name is Tian Junhua. This is Tian, and he was lionized on Chinese state media. They did a major videotape that was a state-sponsored media. So that means in China, all media is tightly controlled. Nothing is broadcast without the approval of the Communist Party authorities. And they followed Tian as he traveled throughout China looking for bats, catching bats in caves. And you'll see him here. He's catching some bats in the cave and taking samples from the bats. He would actually catch them. And he was, according to this report, which came out in December, he actually had found over 2,000 new viruses in China, which up until 2012, they had not found over 2,000 viruses in the entire world. So the Chinese researchers, based on the 2003 SARS outbreak, launched an aggressive campaign. This is a map showing the distance between the CDC and the market. So you can see that it's close. Now, I make the point here is that the first thing that is a problem with the Wuhan virus or the COVID-19 virus is that we don't know what the origin of that virus is. And I talked to a number of experts, including people who were involved in the US biodefense at Fort Detrick, Maryland. And they said that you have to get the very first samples of the virus in order to be able to track down and understand its origin, understand its genome sequence, and then understand the ways that it infects people, the way that it's contagious, the way that it affects the human body. And China has refused to do that. Initially, the Chinese Health Commission and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is another laboratory which is about 20 miles from this place, they initially offered samples, but under pressure from the Communist Party, no samples were forthcoming. This is a paper that was published in a magazine, a British medical journal called The Lancet, a very prominent publication. And it was done by 29 Chinese scientists and doctors. And these were doctors who worked at that first laboratory. And basically, they were the ones that were dealing with these patients. And this study was the very first study done in China which talked about what happened. And they basically said that this new virus was emerging and that it was very similar to and could potentially facilitate human-to-human transmission. Okay, mark the date, January 7th. This is the time when the scientists were saying that we have a problem because it can go human to human. In the previous SARS outbreak, it did not go human to human, or it was more limited in going human to human. They thought it was just a question of dealing with a wild animal. And the theories for how the virus began, again, we don't know. China has covered up, they've lied, and they've deceived. And they believe that somehow a bat passed the virus on to a host animal, perhaps a civet cat, which is one of the wild animals that they eat at these wild animal markets, Or in this case, there was suspicions that a pangolin, which is an anteater native to China, may have somehow gotten infected. And when one of the workers was doing it, he somehow got the virus and set the ball rolling into what we now have as a global pandemic. But very early on, the Chinese government was saying there's no very low possibility of human-to-human transmission. And this is some of the quotes from that report. Now, on January 12th, this was on January 7th, I should say, Chinese Supreme Leader Xi Jinping, who has taken over China in 2012 and since that time has amassed more power than Mao Zedong. He abolished the term limits on Chinese leaders and basically made himself emperor for life. And he took over on January 7th and handled the thing. And one of his fatal mistakes, and again, a lot of questions have been raised about why he did this, but there was the Lunar New Year coming up. And the question was, should they lock down travel from Wuhan? And basically what happened was they did not do that. They decided to allow people to leave Wuhan for the lunar holiday, and as many as between 4 million and 5 million people from Wuhan in the early stages of this outbreak. So basically, we don't know what percentage of those million people were infected, because one of the features of the virus, as we've all learned recently, is that for a long period of time, you don't have any symptoms of it. So it's during that time when you don't have symptoms that you can actually spread the virus. And that's exactly what happened. These Wuhan travelers became literally viral ticking time bombs that traveled all over the world. Another thing that happened, this is a Lunar New Year's banquet. Rather than cancel the banquet because of this outbreak, the authorities decided to let them have the banquet. They did that. This is another report that came out about the coronavirus. I put this out. Basically, this confirms that it was December 1, and it says none of the family members developed fever, and there was no epidemiological link was found between the first patient and later cases. So in the hunt for viruses, the one thing that you really need to do is find what they call patient zero. That's the first person infected with the virus. This is as close. They don't think that this December 1 case was patient zero. They don't really know where patient 1 is, and the Chinese have not been cooperative about it. Here's Xi Jinping, again, in charge. His rule right now is under question. There's a very strong possibility we may see an earthquake change in government in China in the coming weeks or months. First of all, the Communist Party of China is reviled. It's a very corrupt organization. People have described the top Chinese leadership as kind of like a mafia families, where each family has a powerful influence. They're in the military, they're in the party, and they control the entire country. This is it may be hard to see on your screens, but basically it's how they passed the virus genome sequence. It was given to communist authorities on January 5th, but they did not do anything with it. So one of the courageous professors there, Professor Zhang, he published the data on an international database. As a result of that, and again, why did he do this? He wanted the world to know that there's a new and deadly virus coming out of China. And the next day, his laboratory was closed for, quote, rectification. And only a few days later, under international pressure, after it had been posted, that the Chinese National Health Commission actually released it. Now, it gets very interesting around February 27th. We're kind of jumping forward, and I can elaborate on any of these things in the questions. I'm going to go for a little bit longer, and then I'll take your questions. But this is Zhong Nanshan, and he is the top virology expert in China. And he gave a press conference on February 27th where he said something that was highly unusual. Up until this time, the Chinese government's response to the outbreak was, this is the result of people exposed to a virus at the wild animal market, and that's how it began spreading. Well, Zhang says February 27th, the virus may not have originated in China. And so that was a red flag. Up until that time, they were saying it was from the wet market, as they call it, and now he's saying it's not originated in China. I want to toot my own horn here a little bit. On January 26th, in the Washington Times, I published the first story, which said, the headline was, "Coronavirus may have originated in Chinese laboratory." I was immediately attacked politically by people who disagreed with me. And at one point, even Facebook tried to label the story as fake news. They relented under pressure, but we basically pressed forward because there was no fake news in there. The story was completely accurate. And in the story, I interviewed an Israeli military intelligence expert, a medical doctor who had studied the Chinese biological warfare program, which is a secret program. And he said that this main laboratory in China, known as the Wuhan Institute of Virology, was linked to their covert biological weapons program. I also said in that story that rumors had begun circulating on the Chinese internet that it wasn't China that caused the outbreak, it was the United States. This had been done in the past by the Soviet Union. Back in the 1980s, they used to spread the lie that the AIDS virus was created by the US military in Africa to cause as a biological weapon. So we see here, this is the genesis of a new disinformation campaign. This here is Zhao Lijian. He is a deputy foreign ministry spokesman, and he's the one that came out with actually saying that he believed, suggesting that the US Army was behind the outbreak. So here you have an amazing series of events, because China had lost control, mishandled the outbreak, repressed scientists who tried to sound the alarm, refused to give samples, refused to share the genome sequence, and now they're saying that it's not China that did it, it's the United States Army. The basis of the disinformation is very clever. In October of last year, again, that's 2 months before the outbreak in December, the Chinese military hosted a large-scale sporting event. They called them the Military Sporting Games. And this guy was claiming that the US Army took part in there and that these Army soldiers spread the virus. This is an outrageous lie. It was not harshly condemned by the Trump administration. I was totally shocked by it. It took a while, a little bit of digging in my reporting, but I was able to find out that the reason that the Trump administration did not condemn it, they criticized it and said it was false, but they didn't condemn it was because, and this is politics, if you're surprised that there's politics in Washington, don't be. In January, the president concluded a major trade deal with China, which was very unfavorable to the Chinese. It required China to buy $250 billion worth of American goods in exchange for US lifting some of the tariffs that had been imposed. Right now, there is very real concerns that that trade deal won't go through, that China will renege. The Chinese, I know I have friends who've done negotiating, American friends who've done negotiating in China, and they say the Chinese, whenever they make a deal, it's their understanding and their view of it that that deal is only valid on the day that you shake hands, that if conditions change, the Chinese do not feel obligated. So there's real concern, but in any case, there was not a real hard pushback. This is, how did the president push back? He began by calling the virus the Chinese virus. And this was a photograph captured by the Washington Post of the president's briefing book. And you can see that he had changed the name of coronavirus to the Chinese virus. And of course, he was tagged with charges of racism, which the Chinese disinformation operation picked up on. So there was a kind of a war of words going on between the president and the Chinese. It ended with a phone call between Xi Jinping and Trump, where they agreed to a truce. It wasn't an end of the war, it was a truce. So I want to talk a little bit to conclude here and take your questions on Chinese strategy. China has adopted what Xi Jinping calls the China dream. And it's kind of based on the idea of the American dream, only it's really the idea that China has been suppressed for decades and is now going to take its rightful place as the global supreme ruler of the world. This is a serious thing. It's not just that they feel destined to do this, they also have a false view that the United States is a declining power. And the reason for that is that the US is the main obstacle to achieving the China dream. The Chinese are steeped in ancient strategy. Sun Tzu is known for the acme of skill, defeating your enemy without firing a shot. So whether or not the Chinese deliberately released this or didn't control it, there's all kinds of things that are going to be required to find out in the coming weeks. A lot of reports out of China say that the Chinese authorities, the party, allowed travel, banned travel from Wuhan to other parts of China, but did not ban travel to outside of China. And therefore, some people speculate, and we don't know, perhaps China was saying, well, why should China be the only ones to get infected with this and let it spread globally? We don't know. But clearly, one of the Chinese key strategy is to hasten the demise of the United States. We often hear about the rise of China, but we as part of that rise, China is working diligently in many ways, politically, diplomatically, intelligence channel, information ways, to bring about the demise of the United States. So what do we do? So here's my policy solutions, and I'll stop after this. First of all, we need to deal with this global pandemic, which has basically shut down the global economy and caused mass disruption and death on a large scale. We need to get to the bottom of the origin of this coronavirus. So I'm saying we should cut off all friendly trade relations with China until there is an investigation. This investigation should not be allowed by the World Health Organization. It should be a US-led investigation, and we basically should hold our trade relations with China. They need us, we also need them, but they need us more until they come clean about what happened at those laboratories and at that wild animal market. Secondly, Congress should abolish China's sovereign immunity to permit lawsuits. Americans have been extremely damaged, and sovereign immunity prevents allowing China's government to be sued in court. So Congress should act on that. We need to fix the supply chain. Any American company that is dependent on China for the supply chain should be penalized, and it should be ended. We learned that during the when the FDA said that we're highly dependent on pharmaceuticals from China. And what was China's response? They threatened to throw the United States into a vast well of the pandemic. We also need to halt all training of Chinese managerial, technical, and scientific personnel. Not all the students, I think that can stay, but the top people that we're training for these institutes, like the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And then last, we need to counteract the CCP's takeover of international organizations. President Trump just announced today that the US is suspending its annual $400 million to the World Health Organization. I didn't elaborate on it in my talk, but the World Health Organization is complicit in this pandemic. They knowingly accepted false and misleading information from China, specifically that the virus was not transmittable from human to human. And then so we need to fix that, and we need to expel the CCP also from the World Trade Organization. I will stop there and turn it over to Erica, and we can begin to field your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bill. That was wonderful. One of the many side effects, and it's not great doing this virtually, is that you'd be getting a huge round of applause. So I'm sure you're out there, Liberty Forum people, and doing it in your hearts, or even do it in real life. Just give them a nice round of applause. So that was really great. So we have some good questions already. And to my my friends out there at Liberty Forum, I'll do the best I can to keep up with everything. After 4 years of doing it from index cards, that was pretty okay. But now this is going to be different. But we have some good ones to get going to begin with. So, and you mentioned this already in your remarks, and I think a lot of people in the audience would say, will we be able to actually disconnect from China's grip on our economy? They make a lot of stuff, a lot of medical stuff, electronic stuff, clothes, coffee pots, all kinds of things. Could you comment a little bit about, first, how deep is it? And if we are, I think I've just heard anecdotally is that we're trying to bring things onshore. What's the best way to do it? How long would it take? A couple of comments on those subsections.
Sure. This is a huge challenge. This is the issue of what is known as decoupling. In my book, Deceiving the Sky, I go into this in fairly extensive detail. Let me just say that for the last 35 years, successive Republican and Democratic administrations have said to businesses in America, don't worry about trading with China, just go ahead and invest. The notion was that if we traded with China, if we did business with them, that this would have a moderating influence on them and would create a moderate, normal, non-Marxist, Leninist state. Well, bad news. It was an utter failure. So now what do? We have an economy that is very, very inextricably linked with the Chinese economy. But I think that beginning with the Trump administration, they've taken major steps, first of all, to crack down on China's technology transfer. The White House did a report in 2017, which was truly startling. For the first time, they were able to gauge the amount of technical and scientific information that had been stolen or otherwise acquired by China. And the amounts range from 250 billion annually to as much as 600 billion annually. They've got a lot of stuff. And they're also using it. They've done cyber attacks. We know about the big data and massive cyber attacks. I think it's possible to decouple. It's certainly, we couldn't do it all at once. I would point out that the Japanese government just announced within the last week that they're going to pay Japanese companies in China to relocate. So it's doable. Like anything, it will. It's kind of like chemotherapy. You know, it'll almost kill you if you do it, but if you don't do it, you're going to die. I think it's like that. We need to decouple our economy from China.
Thank you. That was a great answer. And other things we have just sort of heard in the press and among ourselves is there's theories about the actual beginning. We've talked about the wet markets. There are theories that came out of a biological lab, which would be an accident, or intentional germ warfare. Do you have any theories on any of those?
Yes, I've looked at this extensively, and the virus experts who have studied it, and I've looked through a lot of scientific reports. I've had to learn about receptors and spike proteins and all of these kinds of things. The best experts that I've talked to said that it does not appear that it was engineered in a lab. Most likely, and again, we don't know the answer. We don't know because the Chinese won't tell us. But at first it was that somehow an infected animal infected a human, and this bat virus spread. That theory is, again, because the Chinese are using disinformation to steer away from that, has led to the lab escape theory, as I call And that theory is definitely much more plausible, although the evidence for it is still out there. And I would say that my guess is because it's just too much of a coincidence, you know, that this bat virus researcher, Tian Junhua, was working at the Wuhan CDC, which, by the way, is a level 2 security lab. It's not equipped to deal with highly deadly pathogens. There is a level 4 security level at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They too were also studying coronaviruses. My guess is that, and this has happened in US in the Fort Detrick lab. I read a very interesting book called Inside the Hot Zone by Dr. Mark Korda-Peter, who I interviewed for my monograph. And he said that he remembered a case where researchers at this high secure lab in Fort Detrick were working on the Ebola virus, and they were trying to eject Ebola virus into a mouse, and the mouse jumped and he ended up poking himself and sticking himself with live Ebola virus in the palm of his hand. So those accidents do happen. China has had leaks of the SARS-1 virus in the past, and they don't have good security. Just today, the Washington Post reported that cables from State Department cables from 2018 said that the lab security in Wuhan was very bad and dangerous. So I think it was, when all the dust settles, if we do get a full accounting from the Chinese, I think it will be that there was some mishap, an infected worker, or perhaps a lab animal that may have been stolen. There's massive corruption in China. Someone could have stolen one of the lab animals and sold it to the wet market.
Okay, there are a couple of related questions that deal with the first victims, I guess, of the virus in China. And we don't believe the numbers we get, but do you have any idea of how many Chinese were actually infected and how many have passed away? And part two, how is it possible that there are no reported cases in Shanghai or Beijing, and they all seem to be concentrated in Wuhan?
Yeah, the Chinese party and government went into full crackdown mode on all information. It was a test of the system, and the system functioned in cracking down on information. The numbers of what China has said were infected don't comport with reality. There was a Bloomberg report that said US intelligence had reported to the White House that the Chinese had deceived the world about the numbers. Just this week, I reported that American Enterprise Institute analyst Derek Scissors estimates that instead of the 83,000 people who were infected in China, the actual number would be closer to 2.9 million. And that rather than just 3,300 people who died, which is way low, the number of dead were probably in the range of at least 136,000 people.
Much different than what we're getting. Getting back maybe to the politics of it, do you have evidence that Xi Jinping may be ousted? And my personal question is, if that were to happen, what would take his place?
Very good question. Xi Jinping is very unpopular. He came to power in 2012. He's a princeling, that is the son of the Communist Party elite. He is not popular, and one of the reasons he's not popular is he's launched over the past 7 or 8 years a massive purge, political purge, under the guise of anti-corruption. And he's purged anyone that even is remotely a contender for power. We don't know much about the internal workings of China. And as I report in my book, Deceiving the Sky, back in 2010, the CIA suffered one of its worst intelligence disasters when as many as 24 or more of the recruited agents inside China were compromised and caught, executed, or imprisoned. So the US has been really blind to what's the inner workings. Most of the best US intelligence on China comes from the National Security Agency, which has the long electronic ears capable of intercepting and decoding communications. My feeling is that the situation in China today is analogous to the Soviet Union in the late 80s and early 90s, right before the collapse. I can remember back then that the CIA was telling the world that, oh, it doesn't look like the Soviet Union's going to collapse at all. Its economy is on par. The security organs will keep it together. China has a massive security system to keep the party in power. So it's hard to gauge how how weak they are. But there have been signs. One of the signs was the arrest and detention of a well-known communist named Ren Zhiqiang. Now, Ren, his nickname is Big Cannon, was a real estate tycoon in China. In fact, before Trump was president, they called him the Donald Trump of China. And in 2016, he got in trouble for calling for a free and independent press, independent of the Communist Party. And he had as many as several tens of millions of followers on WeChat, the Chinese social media. The Chinese cut him off. But the interesting thing was Ren, or Big Ren Cannon, was a very close confidant of Wang Qishan. Now, Wang is the financial czar of China, currently is the vice president, but back in 2016, he was on the Politburo Standing Committee, that 7-member group that controls the collective dictatorship that rules China. And Wang Qishan actually issued a statement of support for Ren. Well, just last week, Ren was imprisoned and they announced that charges were against him. So that's the first inkling that all is not well in the leadership compound in Beijing known as Zhongnan High.
Okay, the next question has more of a deals into higher education and academics. With a large number of Chinese nationals in some very prestigious U.S. universities, is there any thought, and I understand universities are probably not the best people to think about this, but they're worried about the work in research labs, tech companies, stealing intellectual property. Any thoughts on Chinese nationals at U.S. universities?
It's a problem. And the reason it's a problem was because the initial idea behind that program, there's about 300,000 Chinese students interspersed with some researchers. And the idea behind that program was that by showing these students the American way of life, the free and open environment, the student environment, that this would somehow influence China's move towards democracy. Well, that hasn't worked. And what has happened instead is that American universities have become financially dependent on these students. Many universities say that they would go out of business if they didn't have the Chinese paying full price for their education. Again, I think that we should have a program that would require Chinese students who come to the United States to take courses on democracy and free markets, to study the American way of life. I think that that should be a requirement. And in that way, we can have some kind of a real influence rather than allowing these researchers to come here and then go back to China and to make hypersonic missiles and nuclear weapons that could be used against the United States someday. So it's a national security concern. There's not a lot of easy solutions to it, but I think that American universities need to find another source of income.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point. Well, every month when I do Q&A, there seems to be a theme that on whatever topic we're discussing. And this month, it's comments related to who believes the Chinese, what's the thought in Asia, other Asian countries, U.S., other Western countries. And for example, in our people on this webinar, I think we're all in our own little bubble. We thought, well, of course they're lying. They're very disreputable. Outside of conservatives, what is the general thought? Does everyone know the gig is up? Do even people who don't say it? Or if you could discuss that.
Yeah, I think that if there's any silver lining at all in this horrible global pandemic, it's that the reality of the Communist Party of China and its regime has been a wake-up call, not just for the United States, but for the world. You won't see it reflected in the mainstream media today, which has been captured in many ways by Chinese propaganda. And again, the Chinese are extremely good at doing propaganda and influence operations. They control media reporting by saying who can come into China and who can't, who can cover China. And so I think that this has been a real wake-up call. Right now, the entire world is angry at China. And that's why China has launched this disinformation campaign to try to divert attention to its missteps and egregious mishandling of this crisis. I think, and you know, in Washington right now, it's a very hyper-partisan atmosphere, but there's one area of agreement that people are emerging on the China threat. Both Democrats and Republicans, it's going to be a key issue in the upcoming presidential election, and we'll see. Last October, the Vice President Mike Pence gave a speech where he talked about China working diligently to undermine President Trump. President Trump, I got to tell you, has done more for American national security by confronting China and pushing back against China than any president in the last 40 years. It's been a major shift. And the reason that he's done that is that he wants America to succeed. He wants to end the endless wars that we're seeing around the world and start rebuilding our country and modernizing our country. I think that this issue of China is going to be front and center. Joe Biden, the likely Democratic nominee, has initially said, he's been quoted as saying, oh, the United States can't compete with China. We shouldn't even try. He immediately backed down from that statement because he knew that it was politically untenable. Even within the Democratic Party, there are strong feelings that China needs to be confronted on its technology theft, its cyber attack operations, its human rights abuses. All of these things are coming to a head in China. At the same time, we're going to have a debate in the presidential election this year.
Along those lines, in terms of propaganda, someone in our audience wants to know, are the Chinese communists in cahoots with our mainstream media, or are they independent circles?
I don't think I wouldn't say there's a control factor. I would say that they've clearly been influenced by the Chinese influence operations. China spends billions of dollars a year to influence the US media. And how do they do that? Well, we only see a few outward signs. For example, in farm states, after President Trump imposed tariffs, China bought advertising inserts, its propaganda, and had them placed in Midwestern newspapers. So that's the kind of thing they do. The other thing they've been very successful at is literally buying senior officials, former senior officials of government to lobby for them. For example, Huawei Technologies, the big technology company that's trying to corner the market on 5G technology, they hired former Democratic Senator Joe Lieberman to be a lobbyist for them. And that's happening on a large scale. China is using its money to buy these officials, and these officials are lobbying on behalf of China. There hasn't been a lot reported on it. The media certainly hasn't gone after them. All one need do is watch some of the briefings. I was trying to get a question into the White House Coronavirus Task Force about the origin of the virus. There hasn't been a single question to the president or his top advisors about whether or not we need to find out the origin of this virus to be able to stop the pandemic. Today, however, someone asked at the Pentagon, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said, US intelligence is investigating the origin. That's the first question since this virus outbreak has had. That's the first question a senior official has been asked about the origin of the deadly coronavirus.
You mentioned Huawei a second ago, and there's a question about Chinese 5G. We, of course, not using theirs and using our own for telecommunications. How do we make sure we use our own 5G equipment as we roll out the updated telecommunications?
Yes, this is a major technology conflict. It's been going on behind the scenes for the last 5 or 6 years. Chinese state-owned companies. Now, Huawei tries to bill itself. Huawei Technologies is the largest telecommunications company in the world. And they are moving rapidly around the world to try to lock in their technology, that anyone who sets up a 5G network that requires lots of infrastructure will have to use Huawei technology and Huawei equipment, routers, switches, and so forth. These come with security vulnerabilities. In other words, they have private security firms have identified backdoor entry points that allow the Chinese government to get in to those routers and route the equipment to get information and steal data. ZTE is another company, and the U.S. is lagging behind in the race for 5G. The good news on the 5G front is that there's some new technology out there, a new encryption technology, which will secure U.S. 5G networks, at least for the next 5 or 6 years. It's kind of low key, but it will be emerging somewhat in the coming days or weeks.
Great. Go to the next one here. This is something that has interested me. Has someone been able to explain the connection between Wuhan and northern Italy, as northern Italy got really bombed with it so early? Was it traffic patterns, or are there any theories on that?
It's very uncertain. I talked to some experts about it, and it's still under investigation on why Italy was hit so hard with the Wuhan coronavirus. One medical doctor told me that one interesting thing about what happened in Italy was that the coronavirus, which has been relatively stable in terms of mutating and creating other forms, in Italy, it mutated into 2 different strains of the COVID-19, and then somehow it reemerged as a single strain. I don't know the science behind it, but that's what I was told, and I think that that could probably explain why Italy, of the European nations, was slammed so hard with so many infections and so many deaths.
Kind of staying in the medical realm here. Do you have any comments about the total failure of the WHO? Is it just as simple as corruption, or is there just more stuff going on there?
No, there's a good story there. I've tried to write a little of it in my forthcoming monograph, although it's very complex. But basically what happened, it goes back to, again, the 2003 outbreak of the SARS disease. After SARS broke out, China decided that it was going to become a, quote, world health power. And it managed through various machinations and I don't know the exact means, but they managed to place an Asian American into the position of director of the World Health Organization. That person passed the scene, and along comes the Dr. Tedros. He's an Ethiopian Marxist-Leninist. He was part of the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party in Ethiopia. He's not a medical doctor. He's a PhD, and he rose to the top. Very early on in the crisis, I was reporting about how he had shifted or leaned toward Beijing. He went to China and met with Xi Jinping, and he came back and he said, oh, China is doing great work in cooperating and in dealing with this outbreak. It was a total lie. He was either deceived or he allowed himself to be manipulated by the Chinese Communist Party. The president announced today cutting off funding, and again, they're going to be looking into that. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot of new information about the foibles of the World Health Organization. It really was almost a criminal failure on the part of this organization. This is an organization with one mission, and that mission is to deal with a global pandemic. I can tell you that all they wanted to do is hold conferences and spend millions and millions of dollars on salaries for UN bureaucrats to hold conferences. And when the crisis emerged, they were totally unprepared, and worse. On January 12th, they issued a statement that said that China is cooperating and there's no information indicating that this disease can be passed person to person. They also said there should be no restrictions on travel. And again, this was a major failing, which led to this global outbreak that we're now dealing with.
We'll just take a few more. We certainly appreciate it. And it just occurred to me it's late at your end of the country, but there's so many good questions, and we certainly appreciate your comments. Could you comment on the Confucius Institute and its global strategy as I think a well-respected institution, and how is it involved in all this?
Yes, Confucius Institutes are part of the Chinese Communist Party's influence operations. They're under the education ministry, but they're really part of something called the United Front Work Department, which is a Communist Party organization, which is a quasi-intelligence and influence organization. There are about 100 Confucius Institutes, and ostensibly they're set up on college campuses, and some of them even in high schools, with the idea of teaching Chinese. The Chinese have been careful in how they're using them. Clearly, they have some intelligence purposes. There was a recent court indictment of a Chinese academic in New York who was involved in what was known as the 1,000 Talents program to buy American expertise and officials. And that was the first case that mentioned that that Chinese national who was indicted was working with a Confucius Institute on one of the major college campuses. So there's a big push now to try to get rid of those institutes.
Okay, just a couple more. Is going back to economics. China owns a lot of property and business interests in the U.S. I think we were aware several years ago they were buying a lot of our debt. They hold U.S. Treasury debt. What are the implications of that? And does it make it perhaps more difficult understanding that they purchased a lot of our debt?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about that. They own trillions in U.S. debt, and they haven't threatened to call in that debt, except a couple of times in the past. There was when the U.S. sold weapons to Taiwan. Excuse me, got a tickle.
Get some water.
They sold weapons to Taiwan. One of the Chinese generals threatened to call in American debt as a way to punish the United States. When the U.S. government is asked about this, they say that, oh, China would never do that because it would hurt China more than the U.S. But it's certainly something that needs to be considered. And again, as part of the decoupling, that should be one of the things that should be looked at, moving that debt from China to other friendly countries.
Based on what you've heard there in D.C., our political leaders in Congress are beginning to craft legislation about what to do next. Who are the ones that have it right, in your opinion?
Well, like I said, there's an emerging consensus that I've seen more bipartisanship on China. Now it's becoming a question of who's tougher on China than it used to be, who could be more conciliatory. There's been some legislation introduced. I think some of it has to do with imposing sanctions on China. One congressman introduced legislation that would somehow punish China unless it closed the wild animal markets, which again, it's a no-brainer. If this is where supposedly some of this virus was spread, then it seems logical. By the way, they closed the market and swept away the evidence, but the Wuhan market was recently reopened. So it tells you that the party has a vested interest, a cultural interest in keeping that wild animal meat going.
Well, this could not have been a more timely talk. We so appreciate you being our virtual guinea pig or Zoom guinea pig. And with that, thank you very much all, however many of you called in today. We had my computer says 148, and that's lines. So a couple people are watching you in pairs, I'm sure. So this was a huge success. We're so grateful. And with that, Q&A, I'll turn it back over to you for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Erica. I'll conclude things very quickly here. Bill, thank you very much for your insight, your commentary. As we've all said, the timing was perfect, and your knowledge is outstanding, and we appreciate your sharing it with us. Erica, you did a wonderful job as the co-host, fielding the questions. Thank you very much. I also want to thank my wife, Jeanette, who managed to get us through the knothole with the technical glitch earlier. And mostly, thank you for all who attended. We appreciate your doing this. We're looking to probably have to do this again in May. We'll keep you apprised of that. But again, thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. I hope you all have a good evening.
Thank
Stay
you
safe.
very much.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.